Okay, let's wrap this brain up with a short discussion on the flow of cerebral spinal fluid. Now, for students that are sitting in lab, this is probably the hardest part of the brain because it's kind of hard to conceptualize it. But we're going to try and work through this. I've got a few pictures. Make sure you check out Dr. West's videos that show you the actual models. I'm going to show you some pictures and talk about the cerebral spinal fluid. So if you look at your list, all right, to start off with the list, it says cerebral spinal fluid flow, and it has choroid plexuses and then ventricles. So let's move to our picture here, and I want to kind of explain cerebral spinal flow with this picture. Now, the cerebral spinal fluid is held in these structures called ventricles. So these ventricles are these blue areas in this diagram. Now, what is confusing is that those blue areas are actually spaces within the brain. So they are spaces filled with the cerebral spinal fluid. And so we've got 4 different ventricles that hold cerebral spinal fluid that are in the brain. So this picture right here is showing us these ventricles. So they are inside the brain, and we have 4 of them. There are 2 of these kind of C-shaped lateral ventricles. They're called lateral ventricles because they are on each side. They're in each side of the hemisphere. They are in the right side and the left side. So if you look at this, you can see that this diagram is trying to show you that there are 2. These are called lateral ventricles. The third ventricle, so these are ventricles 1 and 2. You don't have to call them 1 and 2, just call them lateral ventricles. But they are connected by this central ventricle called the third ventricle. The third ventricle is then connected to this ventricle that's between our brain stem and our cerebellum. This lump right here is known as the fourth ventricle. So we have these 4 ventricles that make up the reservoirs for our cerebral spinal fluid. So if you look at these, we have lateral ventricles, and then it says we have the third ventricle and the fourth ventricle. Those are those blue spaces. Now, this is tricky because they're spaces within the brain. They're not actually solid material. So if I go back to our picture here, and I am going to scroll down. When we look at our typical picture that we're interested in for most of the other structures that I just covered in the last video, you're going to see that there are no real obvious ventricles. The lateral ventricles are not displayed on a picture like this because they are offset. They're not on the center. So you won't see them because they are in this area right here, kind of on either side of that corpus callosum. So you don't see the lateral ventricles. Now you can see that third ventricle. So if I go up to this picture, this third ventricle, you see how there's that little oval in the middle? This blue third ventricle is in the middle of the thalamus. So the third ventricle is all around this intermediate mass. This is the third ventricle right here. All right. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, but you just told us that this is the thalamus. Well, the third ventricle is in the middle of the thalamus. All right. So imagine this. Imagine that my hands are the thalamus. Our thalamus isn't flat like this. So if this is my left side of the brain and this is my right side, this is the thalamus. They don't come together like this. The thalamus is actually shaped like this. So when the left and right parts of the thalamus come together, you have a space inside the thalamus. That space inside the thalamus is our third ventricle. So this picture right here, this is showing us the thalamus. That's the region of the diencephalon that we need to know. But the space in the center is the third ventricle. All right? So those lateral ventricles you can't see on a diagram like this, but this third ventricle you can. It is in the center of the thalamus. Now, if we look at this picture too, these arrows are showing us cerebral spinal fluid flow. What happens is the cerebral spinal fluid is made in these structures called choroid plexuses. And on this picture here, this red structure that's in the third ventricle, that red structure is a choroid plexus. So it's making cerebral spinal fluid, and the cerebral spinal fluid is then being produced and carried into the third ventricle. Now, the third ventricle then carries that cerebral spinal fluid and moves it down a tube right here called the cerebral aqueduct. Now, on your list, oh no, it's called the cerebral aqueduct. Good. I thought it might have a different name on the list. But this tube right here is the cerebral aqueduct. And it carries cerebral spinal fluid down to our fourth ventricle, which is this triangle between the brainstem and the cerebellum. So this triangle here is our fourth ventricle. Now look, if I go up to the other picture, this tube coming down is the cerebral aqueduct. Don't worry about these names. These are alternative names. You think of it as the cerebral aqueduct right here. So this tube is the cerebral aqueduct, and then this enlargement is our fourth ventricle. Now the fourth ventricle is going to then lead to a tube that goes down the spinal cord called the central canal. So there's cerebral spinal fluid that's going right down the center of your spinal cord through this central canal. So all of our ventricles contain those choroid plexuses. So the ones that you see on our models and our pictures are usually the one in the third ventricle. But see, if I go back to this picture, you see how there's a red cluster of tissue in the fourth ventricle as well. That's the choroid plexuses of the fourth ventricle. The red clusters up here are the choroid plexuses of the third ventricle. And the lateral ventricles also have choroid plexuses. You just don't see them on the diagrams. Now, in Dr. West's video, she will show you a model of the ventricles, and you will see little pink structures on the model. Those pink structures are all the choroid plexuses. So that kind of takes care of our ventricles. Now, there are a few other things on the list. It says that you need to know the septum pellucidum, and then it lists the interventricular foramen, and then these two things called apertures. Well, if I go back to this picture, where the lateral ventricles are located are kind of right next to this corpus callosum. Even though you can't see them on this picture, they are right here. They're just lateral. They're to the left and to the right of this corpus callosum. There is a thin membrane that separates the two, and it's located between this corpus callosum and this fornix. So this darker area right in here is a divider. It's a thin membrane called the septum pellucidum. And it is literally a membrane that is dividing between those lateral ventricles. So if you have a left lateral ventricle and a right lateral ventricle, right down the center is that septum pellucidum. And that is what is being demonstrated right here. This is the septum pellucidum. It's between the fornix and the corpus callosum. That interventricular foramen is a connector that connects our lateral ventricles to the third ventricle. See, right here is a connector. And it's kind of cut off here, but it says interventricular foramen. That is a connector. All four of our ventricles are connected. So the lateral ventricles are connected to the third ventricle via this interventricular foramen. Now, it's also called the foramen of Monroe, but you should remember it as the interventricular foramen because that's what's on our list. And then also we've got these foramen that are coming out of the fourth ventricle, and they are called apertures. I don't really like these too much. They're very hard to see, but if you look, it says we have the lateral aperture and the median aperture. Those are these foramen coming off of our fourth ventricle. So the lateral aperture is in the front. The median aperture is sort of coming off of the middle. So the lateral is coming off, I should say, off the sides. And the median aperture is coming off the middle. For my class, really what I'm interested in is if you know that they are part of the fourth ventricle, all right? And that would be adequate. So cerebral spinal fluid is a little bit tricky. It's probably the most difficult part of the brain. But watch these videos a couple times, color them in, print off some pictures, watch Dr. West's video, and you'll be set. So this concludes our brain. Then we're off to the eyeball and the ear, and we'll be wrapping up this test pretty quick. All right, you all take care.